Some say Saturday Night Live, Sunday morning dead. Do you go to church? Why? If you don't go to church, why not? Some of the answers to those questions are going to be discussed with our moral theologian, Father Kevin Mullen. And we are going to be talking with Father Kevin about some of the moral issues facing the Catholic Church today and why, in many instances, Catholics are dropping off, especially in the West, in European and United States, more than in any other places in the world. Why is that happening, and what is happening to the Catholic Church, and how relevant will our church be in the future? So, it's Friar Time. Let's talk to Father Kevin. Kevin, our society and our world are rapidly becoming highly what we would call secularized, or uh, certainly much less connected to faith or religion as a way of life as that used to be. And there are many who state that the teachings of the Catholic Church are becoming less and less relevant. Some would say that a lot of that is because of the sexual abuse scandal, and many would say that the Catholic Church has basically lost its sense of moral authority in terms of its relationship with society. So, how do you respond to that perception? Uh, and what aspects of Catholic moral theology do you believe continue to really still hold relevance in society today?
Sure. One of the things I agree with, the statement that people see the world this way,
Hmm.
and they do. What's the cause? The multiple, but one cause is, if you want to say, we shoot ourselves in the foot, and I say that based on what I've heard from folks in the pews, who I've mixed it up with in a variety of different settings, uh, who will say to me, you know what really drives me out of church is the preaching,
Mm.
because the preaching is all about authority, and that people quote a pope, people quote the Bible on moral issues that I know as a layperson sitting there, neither one has any expertise in, and I'm tired of it, and I don't follow. It's just a little signal to say, in our Catholic tradition, faith has always been based on two pillars: revelation and reason. And I think sadly, one of the things that's happened in our own experience is the reason part has gotten less emphasis. So that our argumentation, in many ways, a cheaper form of argumentation is just to go to authority. You know, I think we all have sympathy for the parent who is exacerbated with the third, 3 year old that keeps asking why, say, because I said so.
Right.
That doesn't satisfy adults. The answer that satisfies a 3 year old does not satisfy an adult. And that can't be said from the pulpit or in other forms. So basically, we need to rediscover that tradition of faith and reason. Um, Theology is understood. Saint Anselm, or Anselm of Canterbury, said in the 10th century, uh, what is theology? Faith seeking understanding, bringing together the tradition of reason. You go in our tradition from the uh, Augustine and prior to him coming right up to the present, it's always been an argued debate between the role of philosophy, the role of revelation, coming together to form a faith statement. We need to rediscover the reason part.
Mhm.
And so when we do, some of these vapid and empty answers to contemporary questions begin to fall apart.
Well, no, that's a good point because I remember that in one of my first theology classes, the professor said the problem with old theology is that it was answering questions that no one was asking.
Exactly.
And I think when you look at uh, society today or members of the church today, I think the same thing is happening. And I think a lot of that has to do with life experience doesn't seem to match in some people's minds the doctrines of the church. It just doesn't fit anymore. And I think that's where we also have a whole, aside from the sexual abuse scandal, a whole nother way of saying, well, it just doesn't fit anymore in what I see around me.
Exactly. And we're the products of an empirical age. We have grown up in the age where science, technology, data control much of our life. And we accept that. And we come to knowledge and some reasoning by our experience. So if something does not match our experience, We have suspicion about it. We're saying, where's this coming from? 'Cause it's not my experience. You know, my experience isn't the only measure. But when you begin to hear it across a broad perspective of people, that our experience does not match what the church is saying, church needs to listen. And thankfully, I believe that's what Pope Francis has done. And Pope Francis calling the synod on synodality, his first imperative, let's stop and listen. Listen to people's experience. Don't come in with preset notions.
Right.
Listen. And that's the key to this issue.
The Catholic Church's stance on certain social and religious issues, such as blessing of second unions for those who are divorced or remarried, which Pope Francis brought up, the blessing of same-sex marriages, which was a topic of the synod, has generated enormous controversy and debate on both sides of the issue. So, how would you see, how would you reconcile these teachings with the evolving social norms that we were just talking about, and various different experiences in our diverse society?
I think one of the challenges, especially for folks in a first world setting like the US, but more and more across the world, is we are so used to instant solutions and very timely resolutions of challenging issues. These issues will not change in an instant. And why not? Because they are not universal experiences that everyone is affirming. And you've highlighted it very well. There are people who say, well, my experience as a tradition is correct on this. And someone else says, well, it doesn't match my experience living today. Those folks have to talk to one another. They have to share that. And it's through the process of discernment with the Holy Spirit that I believe eventually a consensus will emerge. But there's no shortcutting the process. All voices need to be heard. I think that's what Pope Francis has done. And for him, that we are talking and reflecting, and we have to take some movement. We can't say we can wait forever, but it gives me hope. It gives me hope that we're on the right road, because these are in fact complicated and challenging questions. To reverse, a tradition that in most of the sexual areas that are the so-called hot button issues are really the result of medieval theology. 800-year. Is that you don't change that overnight.
Right.
You really don't. But as you look more and more and study it and become aware of its foundations, you see almost immediately some of this got to go right now. Some of this is just wacky and has no foundation in a realistic understanding of the human person.
Now, interesting. Let's just take a little comparison here. So, at one particular point, the current administration of the country, in the government, was talking about forgiving student loans. Okay, and so there was an interview on TV about someone who had paid off $45,000 of their student loan, and so they said, and so now I just paid off $45,000, and now somebody else down the street is being forgiven $45,000. That's not fair to me. That's not fair to me. Well, things change, obviously, right? And so what was yesterday might not be today. People dress differently in 1950 than they do today. Well, some people, not everybody. But so a part of this is the evolution of thought, the evolution of belief. So Pope Francis just recently alluded to the evolution of doctrine. And when he did say that, he was immediately, so to speak, reprimanded by some of the more conservative elements in the American Catholic Church, as this was not something that we believe. Could you talk, because I think what you're saying is these doctrines do evolve, and they have to evolve, right? Or they die.
The irony of this is that uh, the folks that are more traditional, one of the great heroes of the traditionalist movement was John Henry Cardinal Newman, the Oxford Don who moved from Anglicanism in the 19th century to Roman Catholicism. And he was often cited as the true intellectual who followed his convictions and recognized the errors of the Protestant reform and became a Roman Catholic. What they don't know, and they know, but they don't like to highlight, is he did so, and one of his champion phrases was the development of doctrine. And he came to his own position by saying, I see how doctrine unfolds, and it changed me, and I've changed, and now I'm a Roman Catholic, and I want to be a Roman Catholic, and I believe that this is what I should be. And he went on then philosophically to explain this of saying the core truth is consistent and remained consistent in my life. The accidental expressions, the framework around it changed. And that needs to change. And that's how doctrine develops. The core truth remains there, but our expression of it changes.
Now, tell me, let's get concrete with something like that, because I think some of our viewers are going to say, okay, well, that sounds really nice, but now what happens when you push the rubber hits the road on, let's say, like something like homosexuality, which the church has stated in its catechism is morally disordered? So how would we look at something like that? How does the evolution of doctrine, would that ever come to a point in the church where it's an uh, accepted way of life, where the church blesses same-sex marriages? Is that ever a possibility with this evolution of doctrine?
It could be. It certainly could be theoretically.
Hmm.
Practically, I I go at it like horse racing. My practical knowledge might not be as good as my theoretical. Theoretically, yes, it could change, and the core could still be there. But let's look at where the present teaching emerged out of. It begins out of a misunderstanding of human experience and human biology, and it's based on a biology we no longer accept. It's also based on a biblical interpretations that we no longer embrace, and a literalism that comes out. And it comes out of a cultural backdrop where any difference from what was perceived to be norm was immoral. And all of that's in there in this mix. And some of it, I think, is, as folks all know, listening to this, is held very deeply.
Hmm.
Our sexuality is something very personal, very deep. It's defining of a lot of who we are, what we do, and where we go. So there's deeply held convictions here. I think what needs to change immediately is our foundational biology and accepting that what folks like Thomas Aquinas sort of called an unnatural act was based on a biology that does not exist. And would Thomas use the same phrase today? Absolutely not, in my opinion, because he would be right enough to say, "Oh, it doesn't match what we know from the study of anatomy and from the study of human beings. We have to come up with something different." What he would come up with, I'm not going to speculate, but
Mm.
I don't see it that way. So that's one point. The second is you use the phrase that is very troublesome in church teaching, intrinsically evil. Begin to pull that apart. Anyone, for any action, it's evil at the core, and it's very hard. Does that exist in our world? Does God, the creator of all good, allow intrinsic distortion? And people would counter say, well, we're talking about action, not what God created. I understand that. But does that allow a human being to enact this? I would debate no
Mm.
on that. I would also look to the history of that phrase. It doesn't come into the Catholic teaching, in my understanding, until the 16th century. And where does it come in? In the area of sexuality. Because one theologian pronounced a view that got people said, that sounds pretty good. And they kept repeating it. There's no littleness of matter in things that touch sexuality, meaning anything that touches sexuality is always seriously disordered and sinful. He got that in, and that's how they got this whole intrinsic evil that began to flow out of 16th century. We lived pretty good for Jesus' time up to then. Never known the phrase, and nobody getting disturbed by this by any means. So could that change? Absolutely. It should be gone with the wash tomorrow, in my opinion. And I think just that change first alone would make a huge difference to people's experiences. Right now, we're telling folks on an official level, your person is disordered.
Right.
That's a horrible statement. It's a horrible statement. It's not a godlike statement. It's not a Christian statement. It's not gospel. So That has to change, and it could change, and should change. That begins then to open up these other questions. Does that mean there's license and everything? No, it doesn't. I think again the core truth comes down that our sexuality is fully expressed in relationship, and there is room in relationship with God. There's a holiness with this. How people marry and what they call marriage, again, the history of the church shows that in the first few centuries, the church played no role. There was no formal articulation of sacramentality, of marriage. Yeah, they knew the story of Cana and they knew Jesus, blessed marriage and all that was all known. But how did people marry? According to their family and their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Most often it was patriarchal. The two fathers got together and pronounced the covenant or the contract, depending on where they were, and said, "You're married." Church had nothing to do with it. Eventually, people started going to the church afterwards, asking for the blessing, and eventually the sacramentology is added on after. Has that evolved? Absolutely. Has it changed? Yep. Same with confession. The hallmark of moral theology, the sacrament first celebrated only in community, only in a public nature, only once in a while, morphs into, in history, one-on-one, private, frequent. If that isn't a change.
Right.
What was the core truth? God forgives. God forgives, not the priest, God. God forgives. Priest is the witness. And that gets lost. We
Yeah.
lost God forgives and thought the priest did. And so anyway, there's plenty of examples in our history.
Right. So I think that brings us then to the possibility of Pope Francis, and I think most clergy would recognize as the pastoral approach.
Absolutely. And again, something very traditional in our background and taught by some of our finest theologians in our history. Liguri has this in moral theology. This is the pastoral approach to things. People, and where did they get it? It was primarily here in confessions, where they would say, "Here's the law, but in your case, here's how it's probably best you can live it."
Mm-hmm.
And they individualized it, but it was seen. This was not to be discussed publicly. You couldn't have a banner and proclaim it, but it was a matter internal to the two participants.
So, in other words, then this pastoral approach, some would say, I think, in a conservative realm, well, you're just bypassing the
Sure.
teachings of the church.
It's a loophole,
Yeah.
big loophole that should be closed. And okay, that's one way of looking at it. And earlier, you used the example of kind of people who paid off their loans and people who didn't, and that it's unfair. Yes, in an American understanding of jurisprudence, where justice is blind and justice is defined as everybody gets the same part. Biblical justice is distributive. It's based on need and based on that need. Some need it more than others. Again, not to be a fundamentalist in this, but the biblical story is illustrative. The people who go out to work at 9 in the morning get paid the same as the guy who works at 4 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
Is that unjust? Yeah, I worked there. You agreed to work at 9. This guy, can I do what I want to do? Yeah, you can. That's good. God's ability, God's mercy, His largesse blows our minds. So we want to scream unfair all the time, unless we're the beneficiary.
Right.
Then we're really
I
happy.
think God says, your ways are not my ways.
Yeah, exactly. I think a few times.
Yeah. Some argue that that the pyramidical structure of the church, the hierarchical structure, top-down authority, etc., and it's leaning toward more of a Western European culture, can hinder its ability to adapt to modern challenges and understand the unique and diverse communities of people that we see are kind of rising up now in our world. So, Kevin, how can the church address these kinds of concerns and remain a relevant moral authority?
Well, I think it really, the process has begun. And I'm thankful to say in our lifetime, we've gotten to witness it with the Second Vatican Council, which took directly on the pyramidical structure and began to say, not that it was completely wrong, they always held a place for hierarchy, but they began to envision it in being exercised within a communal framework. And they talked to get a phrase again that was new to our ears, but part of our tradition, the communion of bishops and the college of bishops, and talking about the collegial notions that came. And then that got extended to the role of the laity, that the laity were part of the people of God was the church, not just the structure. So that has begun uh, from the 1960s. I think this synod that we've just witnessed this past year has just built upon that. And now I would say the model that is coming from the listening, the discernment, the working together of lay people, bishops, theologians, uh, non believers, even. Right? All of this shows a model that is more concentric
Mhm.
and the intersection of these communities in the concentric circles. So while the hierarchical pyramidical model still is there, it's eroding its foundation. What I would disagree with is that it was just Western. This this kind of model, any culture that was based on authority and on top down, kind of moved into the pyramid. And that happened in the developing nations also,
Right.
in different ways. But clearly, the church, even by the participants of the synod, show it's moving away from Western Europe. It's moving into Asia, Africa, South America in ways it never did before. So the change is coming, and it's here.
Well, I think you can see that with Pope Francis's appointment of cardinals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's no putting down in the European experience.
Right.
It's just saying it's different now. It's changed. The
More
game has
diverse.
moved on.
Yeah.
You know.
Finally, Kevin, what do you believe are the most important moral and ethical contributions that the Catholic Church can now offer to our society, to our world, that's really broken in so many different ways?
I believe it's down to one phrase that I would support comes out of Pope Francis's writings, but it was really coined by John Paul II, and it's the integral ecology. I think if there's one phrase I would ask people to really think about, because it is the linchpin of all Catholic moral teaching. If you believe in the dignity and the value of human life, you believe in integral ecology. If
Could you
to illustrate that, without working for our environment, the value we place on human life developing, the value we place upon it sustaining, and the value we place on it as it reaches its natural end dissipates. And all of that is it loses its support if we don't have the environment. So it's not to say, oh, one is covering the other. No, they're all linked. Working towards one works towards the other. So to me, it's not a hierarchy of listing moral issues. It's really a stance, and it's a vision that says, uh, and this is where it is radical. It is radically pro life right through the whole experience of this life for human beings, life for the planet, life for all creation. Uh, Cherishing the gift of life that God has given us, all connected into that. And then the corollaries to how does a sound economy support life? How does housing support life? How does healthcare support life? You bring in all these other distinct and important moral issues, but they're all linked through that. And that's the lens and the outlook. But you need people clear thinking who will never give up the connections. Keep the connections and keep asking, how's it relate to the other? How do these go together? And I think that's our contribution. And I think our history really allows us to do it. And I think it's a proud history. You study what Thomas Aquinas did in the 13th century. He had a world of universals, and philosophically was everything came out of God and everything's going back to God. How do we understand it? I take that today in a contemporary worldview. I would explain it differently than Thomas, but I agree with the same movement. What's at risk now that wasn't with Thomas, our natural order is being destroyed by us.
Yeah.
By us. We have responsibility for it. We need to accept that and stop it. And if that happens, we have an ability then maybe to get back on track.
Thank you very much, Kevin. This was really enlightening. I want to thank Father Kevin for being with us, and we'll see you next time on Friar Time.
Thank you.